2020s are going to be...
The interesting thing, by the way, I remember when I was a kid, I read these magazines that had, I don't even remember what they were called, but there was an interesting article I read, and it was about how social upheaval is predictable and cyclical, and it happens roughly the same amount of time. And this was back in, like, 2007, probably, or so. And the article said the 2020s were going to probably see some kind of civil upheaval because it follows this same trend. And here we are! Just wanted to point that out, that, like, some random article I read back in the day happened to be pretty right. Fun.
Be a decade of crisis, but also of opportunity for the Western world. It is when the perfect storm that has been gathering for decades will finally play out. The confluence of the broken financial system...
Are we going to do more movie reviews? Yes, Jake and I were just talking about that. I think we're filming one this week. I'm not sure what movie yet, though. I got to pick.
Massive unfunded liabilities, several debt crises, asset bubbles will join the pressures created by the ever-growing income inequality within society and the eradication of the middle class. This, in turn, will feed the ever-increasing radicalization and polarization within society, as the transformation of the West via mass migration will no longer be theoretical or be able to be ignored. And none of this takes into account the dwindling amount of non-renewable resources, environmental pressures, and the continued explosion of population in the developing world, as well as other factors that will, without doubt, add even more pressure and more tension on an already combustible civilization. Put simply, the 2020s are going to be chaotic, economically, socially, and politically, with both sides of the Atlantic facing roughly similar crises, albeit with very different variables. The question remains, how will this perfect storm be dealt with? And more to the point, will the current form of globalization, which has wrought many of these crises to a head, be continued in its current form? Or will the nationalist stirrings being expressed throughout the Western world today come to the forefront in the 2020s?
Jesus Christ, I hope not. This guy's rooting for nationalism? Oh no. Because in the last century, out-of-control nationalism ended so well for the world. The world wars? Anyone? Anyone?
This is just a quick reminder that this is the kind of material I will be publishing on a new channel called Felix Rex. Link is in the description. The reason for this is the current shadow banning and censorship on social media and YouTube in particular. And while
you think they're not going to figure out it's you and do the same thing there? Good luck, bud.
I'll still be posting here on BPS, the bulk of new uploads will be on Felix Rex. So please take a quick moment to subscribe to Felix Rex, as well as the BPS channel on the freedom of speech platform BitChute. Thank you very much, and let's get started now. Canada's current gaffe-prone Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has stated that his nation is the world's first post-national state, a country with no culture to maintain or integrate into, that it is a template for the Western world going forward, and that the forces of globalism are unstoppable.
They are. I hate anyone who's like, regardless of what you think of globalism as a concept, both economically and socially, it is a fact. It has happened and will continue to happen. It's what happens when you live in a society with stuff like the internet, with stuff like free trade. It's not gonna stop. Period. It's only going to get more global. We're only going to get more connected to one another, and that is a good thing. It is not a bad thing. This has happened all throughout human history. We went from, small villages to towns. Those towns became cities. Those cities became kingdoms or city-states. Those eventually became nations. Like, This is the progression of humanity, is expanding our particular in-groups to include more and more people. The end result is inevitably either we destroy ourselves, or we end up viewing every other person on this planet as just a fellow human being, regardless of borders. It's something that's not only inevitable, but necessary for our own survival.
Globalist proponents like Trudeau believe that the nation states, like Canada, are not only obsolete, but they are a hindrance to the newly emerging global order.
Quite honestly, they're not obsolete in the sense that there won't be nation states. Within the United States, we have states, Michigan, Louisiana, Florida, blah, 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 all of them. But we also have a federal government, and we also have free movement, right, throughout the states. I imagine in the future, I'm not saying in the next 10 years, maybe in the next 50, 100 years, I don't know what the future's going to hold, no one does. It wouldn't surprise me if free movement becomes more of a discussion that we have on a global scale, because capital can move so freely between borders. Companies can move their factories all around the globe, and the only way to balance that out economically if you're going to function under a capitalist system is free movement of labor to try and counteract that. Otherwise, capital gets all the power, and you wind up with A, slave labor, and B, people domestically who have no jobs because the manufacturing is moved elsewhere. Also, on top of that, you have automation, which is a whole other discussion. But
globalism has been driven by technological advancement, via financial institutions and the mass media they own, by the internet, travel, commerce, trade, and of course, migration. But what kind of globalization is the real question going forward, especially with an economic system that demands endless growth on a finite planet as it crashes into the social and cultural ramifications of growing inequality, evaporation of social cohesion, and the apprehension within society?
Social cohesion has always been a myth. Social cohesion is not a good thing. Social cohesion is another word for forced homogeneity. The US had a lot of social cohesion in the 50s because people who didn't fall into the norm of the nuclear white landowning family were pushed to the side or ignored or forced to be in the closet in the case of people who are trans, people who are gay, people who are whatever. Right? Even though that looks like social cohesion, you're effectively forcing countless numbers of people into a box that they don't feel they fit into. It's not a positive thing.
That something is going terribly, terribly wrong. And it's for these reasons that there are those that are slandered by the political class, reviled by the financial class, and demonized by the mainstream media that they own, that posit nationalism at its core to be currently the most stabilizing political force that exists against globalization, as it speaks to our human sense of community and belonging, and that far from disappearing, it is resurging throughout most of the Western world despite being constantly vilified by an increasingly nervous elite.
Okay, nationalism is bad, okay? Nationalism is relatively recent in terms of human history. It's not a thing that's helpful. We've seen its destructive power in World War I and World War II. It's not a helpful model of a way of looking at the world and your own identity as an individual. It's not a good way to go about foreign policy. It's not a good way to go about domestic policy. We live in a global society, whether you like it or not, and your policies need to reflect that, period.
In response to their gross mismanagement of globalization.
Does he not understand that
nationalism, as expressed,
does he
in the
not
form
realize
of the
that the
US
elite would be the ones in
of
power under
2016,
nationalism?
as well as the vote
maybe
for the
he
United
just thinks
Kingdom
he'd
to
be
leave
one
the
of the
EU
elite
are
in that
the
case. I
clearest
really don't
examples
know.
of the rising rejection of globalism by the unwashed masses. In fact, there is rising tide of rejection in much of the West, not only to the economic dislocation that is being caused by a world dependent upon global supply chains, but also and especially the cultural and social upheavals caused by mass, unrelenting immigration.
Oh my
And
god.
something important needs to be said here.
Please talk about the social upheaval caused by immigrants, please. Give me any examples that you can actually cite. Because right now in the United States, the social upheavals I'm seeing involve the rights of others, abuse of the police force, right? What does this have to do with immigration?
Here, that globalism as a paradigm championed by the Western political, financial, and media elite that comes complete with open borders and the free flow of capital without restriction is a paradigm shared by no human civilization, including the West, where it is most earnestly being foisted upon. And that is an important point, because nationalism within a global context is not even a question. In the countries that make up East Asia, the planet's other economic powerhouse region, you'll not hear in 10, 20, or even 100 years of any kind of political union between countries like China, Japan, or South Korea.
Yeah, and that's bad. That's not a good thing. Don't look to Japan and say, see, Japan's really xenophobic. Hooray! No. No one is saying that nationalism is solely an American problem. It isn't. It's a problem in many places all around the world. So don't look to Japan with its aging population and lack of population growth. Their population is shrinking because of their crazy work lives. Don't look to them as the model of how to live, because it's not working out for them.
The idea is so ludicrous to any that understand the antagonistic relations between these countries. Yes, most likely you will see more trade agreements and perhaps associations, but nationalism and the retention of sovereignty will remain a potent force in the Far East, which is again the global geopolitical and economic counterweight for decades and decades to come, barring something such as an alien invasion. And thus the question arises, how does the Western world, which is at the center of globalization, that seems to be struggling on how to integrate globalism with nationalism,
let's see, how about we make policies that take the power out of the hands of the very wealthy and instead distribute the benefits of globalism to the populace as a whole instead of congregating all the wealth at the top 1%. It seems like that would benefit everyone. Everyone could benefit from globalism. Everyone can. It's simply that we decide that our overlords, our private sector monarchs that are the capitalists, should be able to get all the gains from globalism. It's silly. It's very, very silly. It's a ridiculous way of structuring your society, and it needs to change.
how does it proceed? The question then arises, how does the Western world, which is at the center of the current form of open borders and unlimited freedom of capital globalization, proceed, as it is being met with a perfect storm of social, environmental, and political crises in the coming 2020s? The UK was the only large country within the EU that was consistently and constantly pushing for it to expand and liberalize. An EU in the absence of London's influence will have the opposite effect and will most likely harden the continent, and it will slide toward parochialism and fossilization. And in this regard, the UK is not to be taken as part of this.
The UK needed the EU more than the EU needed the UK. It's going to be a disaster for the UK as the removal of itself from the EU takes effect and the free movement of labor is removed from their populace. It's already affecting them financially. it's not gonna be bueno for them, okay?
This presentation, but will in fact be the focus of a future video somewhere down the road. At the moment, most of the EU's financial business is centered on the City of London. While some of the EU's financial business will most likely relocate voluntarily,
a ton of it already has, because it's difficult to have offices in the UK when free movement is removed, when it's easier to have it somewhere within the EU where your employees and people coming to your business for whatever reason, to talk about a business deal or whatever, all around Europe, it's easier to do it via free movement within the EU.
most will not. The EU may attempt to force relocation using regulatory means, but given the special status of...
Okay, they're not going to have to force it. Companies are in the business of making money, and if it's costing them more money to be based out of London, they're going to move. This, in theory, is going to be an economic boom for the EU, because a lot of the places that are now centered in London are going to be like, oh shit, this isn't financially advantageous. We better move to Spain or Germany or wherever within the EU.
the city, this will be a losing battle. Because much like the economic crisis and stagnation that is crippling much of the EU, but in particular the southern periphery nations of Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, the EU seems incapable of finding a solution to the migrant crisis. And this is deemed by many not only the reason for the exit of the UK from the bloc, but the single most divisive issue within and between member states. And many state that the attempt to force many of the states in Eastern Europe by France and Germany to accept more migrants could prove to destabilize the bloc even further. And so the 2020s in the EU look to be set by social and demographic pressures that will increase social tensions and
His complaint is literally just, oh no, brown people are gonna be in Europe. Okay, who cares? Who the fuck cares? Who the fuck cares? America has dealt with tons of waves of immigration throughout its entire existence. This is how the world is now. Live with it.
Stress already strained social services. Also, the continued refusal...
How much longer am I going to stream? Let me see. Maybe at the end of this video I'll be done, honestly. I kind of want to go get some dinner.
That's right, capitalistic propaganda.
Redo Taku, thank you for following.
to understand the root and cause, let alone talk about it. Terrorism will continue to plague Western Europe in the near to foreseeable future, and like the streets of France, the increased militarization of cities across Western Europe in response will be that much more visible in the 2020s. But here is the important point.
Okay, sir, do you understand that much of the terrorism that happens globally, especially that based around, let's say, people like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever, they have sort of a nationalistic worldview in the same way you do, except their nation is that of believing that Islam is the way forward, and they're afraid that Western homogeneity is going to stamp out their way of life. They, in their basically nationalistic self-centered fervor and fear, lash out by doing terrorist attacks. Now, I'm not trying to justify those actions. They're terrible. But you're advocating for the same kind of fear and out-group hatred that fuels the kind of people that you are critiquing. And it's not good.
That is almost taboo to state openly. Much of this doesn't matter, as globalism is driven not by the wishes of the majority, but rather by one economic class, the financial elite, who are insulated to the social unrest their policies cause. The financial class have relentlessly also used the mass media that they own to dull down the populace and also promulgate cultural narratives that help suit their goals. Going into the 2020s, look to ever more repressive laws, new speech and hate crime laws, censorship, and other legal and social penalties.
Oh no, not hate crime laws. Who unironically says hate crime laws are bad? Legitimately. Oh no, I'll get punished for being a racist twat. Yeah, fuck you. Good.
That will inevitably arise in an attempt to control the social and economic tensions that are simmering just beneath the surface within Western Europe that only look to worsen. In fact, over the past decade, in many countries within the EU, people are being told repetitively by their national mass media as well as by their own governments that they as a people do not and have never, in fact, existed. Europe, because of demographic pressures, the collapse of cultural cohesion, the fumbling bureaucracy of the EU, looks to be evolving toward a neo-feudalistic dystopian future. It is, however, at these times when internal as well as external conflicts arise that
Friendo, neo-feudalism has been here for a while. It's called a capitalism. Welcome.
can and historically have had a halting effect on the geopolitical forces that are pushing this form of globalism currently in Europe as well as the rest of the Western world. We are seeing this rejection of globalism across the continent, with the vote for Brexit to the rise of nationalist parties in some of the most dystopian societies on the continent, such as Sweden.
Sweden is dystopian? These are the world's happiest countries. Where's the list? Let's see. Sweden! Oh no, it's only number 7 on the world's happiest countries. Oh no. Dystopian indeed. Jesus fucking Christ, these people.
There is a concerted pushback and rejections of policies that have normalized the use of hand grenades on the streets of Stockholm. These sentiments are propelled by stagnant wages coupled with higher costs of living, adding to a deteriorating social environment that has people looking to the past for solutions. Globalism in its current form is now only supported by financial elites, their owned media, a portion of the political class long ago bought off.
Look at this woman with blue hair. She's a tool of the financial elite. Man, I wish the financial elite's checks would start clearing for me. I really need to get my car fixed.
And a shrinking number of ideological zealots that demand open borders. But the silent majority are beginning to find their voice, and increasingly they are turning to national parties that reject the current incarnation of globalism. Without question, without doubt, the crisis that Europe is experiencing today will only intensify in the coming decade, but how it will play out is not as easy to forecast. But one thing is certain. People are beginning to demand from their corrupt political class a different way. The question being, however, will enough people be able to wake up in time to right the course of their countries before calamity? The United States also faces many of the same problems. Massive debt, both public and private. A shaky banking system built on privatizing profits and socializing losses. A government and...
Again, these are all capitalism problems. Why are you blaming this on globalism?
Mass media that has lost all semblance of legitimacy on both the proverbial right and left. And an increasingly polarized society. I think a better and more apt description, like in most of the West, in the United States there are those that are for the current iteration of globalism and those that consider themselves patriots. Similar to Europe, the United States...
What a dichotomy. Okay. I would argue that I am both pro-globalism, because I'm not an idiot and I realize it's an inevitability, and not only that, but I believe that globalism, while difficult and will involve growing pains, will end up raising the living standards of people around the globe, especially in developing nations. Anyway, on top of that, while I criticize America on some of its policies and certainly many of its leaders right now, I care very deeply about where I live and the citizens around me. I would consider myself a patriot. Unlike this guy, who says he's a patriot, but doesn't really seem to care about the ideals that have made this country good. That being, and again, I say these are ideals. I'm not saying America has lived up to them. But we are a nation of immigrants. We're a nation that accepts newcomers, or should accept newcomers, and allow them to assimilate, and their culture becomes our culture and vice versa. And it's a beautiful thing. And that's the most patriotic thing of all, I think, is letting people into the American family and saying, welcome, come, share in our culture, share with us your knowledge and traditions. This is America. Also, mass shootings. That's quite This is America as well.
States has seen vast numbers of people arriving on its shores, and like Europe, it is rapidly changing the demographics of the country. However,
oh no, the demographics are different. Oh no, it's not all white. Who cares? I don't care. I do not care the color of people's skin. Fuck.
Like in Europe, those arriving mostly from Mexico and Latin America are not only better educated, with some 95% of the people arriving being literate, but are in fact much more culturally compatible with the existing population. If immigration could be reduced for a time and newcomers be allowed to integrate, the American creed has had a long history of bringing disparate peoples together.
Okay, yes, and why do you need to even slow down immigration? The number of immigrants that enter into this country, and I'm talking both legally and illegally, is an incredibly small percentage of the overall population. Integration happens. It typically happens more so to second-generation immigrants. This has always been the case. It's the reality in this country and always has been.
But no matter how strong the American creed has been in the past, given current trends, the U.S. does face the significant and real possibility of evolving into a bilingual English and Spanish nation. Using the example of Canada,
and that wouldn't be unreasonable. We're one of the few countries in the world that speaks one language. Many people in Europe speak multiple languages, and it's normal.
And Belgium as warnings. Both countries have intractable challenges.
Oh no, my kids are going to have to learn Spanish. Okay, Karen.
Problems that can and are avoided if all of the country's citizens are able to communicate in one common language. While the great emancipator Lincoln warned that a house divided against itself cannot stand.
And clearly he was talking about people speaking Spanish there, and not the fact that half the country wanted to secede so they could own slaves.
Or thereabouts. In a speech given in 1858, it would seem that the forces of globalism have wrought the same damage and sown the same divisions to the body politic in the United States as it has elsewhere. As can be observed by the stormtroopers of globalism, the self-styled #resistance.
Oh no, the SJWs are gonna make it so America isn't so homogenous. Oh no.
Like their peers in the UK that have already demonstrated with the rejection of referenda that they do not respect the outcomes of democratic elections. So as the state of Texas passes from purple to blue, the tribalization of U.S. elections based on transforming demographics will be complete.
God, I cannot wait until Texas turns not only purple, but someday hopefully blue. What a fucking amazing thing that'll be.
Adding to both bankrupt cities, counties, and states, along with the Californiaization of the country.
Oh no! We wouldn't want the rest of the country to be like California. You know, California, the biggest economy in this country. Jesus Christ.
Economically and socially.
Oh, but trans people exist there, and San Francisco, there's all the icky gays. Grow up.
The 2020s look to be
Jesus.
a decade of crisis in the United States. But a few things to consider. Materially, the United States is in the best position globally. It is the only...
Bailey Quinn says California is like the 15th best economy in the world. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Only country in the world with both food and energy security, backed up by the ability to project power globally. It's also the least exposed to the global economy of major industrial powers as a percentage of GDP, and thus, currently, it can engage and win trade wars with more ease than any near-peer nation or group of nations. Most certainly, America is being harried from without, but more serious challenges come from within. Income inequality, debt, but most of all, the tribalization of society via radicalizing globalist-derived ideologies.
Wait, so it's radical to be a globalist, but you being an ardent nationalist is not radicalization. Do you see the discrepancy?
As well as the transforming demographics of the country will be a serious set of issues to contend with going forward. In terms of nationalism versus globalism, countries in the East are already very comfortable operating in the global system while retaining full sovereignty within their nation states.
Again, that's not working out very well for Japan. It really isn't. They're probably on the verge of like an economic collapse because of it. Collapse. Crisis. Crisis would be a better word. Again, it's not a long-term solution to lock yourselves into your country and not let anyone in. It's not realistic, and it's not how the world is going to work moving forward.
In the West, where the hiccups arise, and these hiccups in Western Europe have grown into a cancer as the continent seems incapable of managing the social, demographic, economic, and financial waves of globalism within an EU framework, and thus the rise of nationalism across the continent. While the US is obviously much better positioned than Europe, a continent country insulated by oceans with food and energy independence and backed up by the US Navy, it too is grappling with the symptoms of globalism.
Dude's
And
Banking
none of
Dude
this
says,
takes
yeah, I
into
heard
account the degradation
Japan
of the
is
environment,
kind of
the
racist to
depletion
anyone
of
who isn't
non-renewable
Japanese.
resources
Yeah.
that is occurring, or
That's what I've heard
outside
too.
problems and contagions that are now, as yet, unknowable that can and will arise in the near future. Whatever the case may be, the 2020s are shaping up to be a decade where the crises that have been fomenting, brewing, and building for years will finally come to a head. How they are handled will set the course for the rest of the century. While in many ways things might look bleak, things are always darkest before the dawn. And it is for those reasons that the decade ahead should not bring a sense of dread to you or anyone watching this video, but one of opportunity. Our destiny is in our hands, and we can shape it any way we like.
Oh, boy. Well, that's enough of Black Pigeon Speaks for today.
Are not oppressed in
God.
America.
Nope. There we go. So, I think that's gonna be it for today's stream. We're coming up on 4 hours now. Thank you everyone for coming to the stream. We had really, really high average viewership numbers today. So thank you for everyone for coming to the stream. I really appreciate it. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow. Let me find my YouTube page. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Hannah Reloaded. You can also, I'll put into the chat right now, I have a YouTube channel where I archive all of these. I'm going to be highlighting all the segments from now moving forward, so I'll both have a full VOD of this up there later today. That'll be the full, 4-hour thing, but I'll also have it chopped up into, here's where I talked about the Flat Earth guy, here's where I talked to about the other stuff, just so it's easier to digest in small bits if you'd like. I don't know if Jake is streaming, actually. You'd have to ask him. Sorry. So yeah, everyone, chat is valid. Remember that always. I love you all. Good night.